and I don't know if anybody will still be in. All right, let's see if we have a YouTube stream going. How are you?
Good.
What's going on over there? You getting ready for a busy day, yeah?
Yeah, but when I'm done this, going to ABC, which is Australian Broadcasting Corporation, for an in-studio radio interview.
Nice, cool. How long are you there?
I'm in Australia until the 23rd of March.
Damn. For your book, or what's the whole purpose?
The book and consulting with different levels and different states of government and law enforcement.
Cool. Very beautiful.
And then I'm here for the Writers' Festival, and then I'm in Melbourne for 9 days, then Canberra for 3, which is the capital, and then Sydney for 4 or 5, and then home.
Nice.
Before the pandemic sets in.
Yeah, no bullshit. Hopefully you don't get that corona.
I got a bunch of boxes of these things like 6 weeks ago.
Yeah. Oh, good. That's right. I remember when you were looking for them, actually. Yep. So I don't know.
I can sell them for $10 a piece.
I don't know if we're live or not. I suppose I'll change the settings here so that we record in this program, and that way we have it no matter what. General output, source alignment, projector system, trace stream, output, audio, advanced, render a video recording, overwrite a file, this filing, formatting. Okay. All right. Well, we'll see.
What time is it there?
It's 6:30. How's everything else going?
Good.
Good. All right. Well, let's see. Create stream. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think we're streaming. Should be streaming live now. So, there probably won't be anyone in the room because this is half an hour later than we announced, but it will be recorded, and then what we'll do is we'll chop it up and we'll share it on the YouTube channel and pass it around on Twitter. I apologize. This,
no worries.
In order to stream onto Skype, you have to utilize a broadcast studio sort of software. And it's kind of a pain in the ass. We should have kind of ran through it earlier. We had problems yesterday with having a bit of an issue today. I don't know for sure if it's streaming, but I believe it is. So we'll find out. But regardless, we do appreciate you coming on and giving us your time. I know that you're busy in Australia, working with your book and doing an array of things. Can you tell us, Tony, a little bit about you? You're the author of The Cure for Hate, but of course, used to be a white supremacist, if you will, if that's the term that you utilize. But can you tell us a little bit about how you got through what you got through and what the purpose is of The Cure for Hate with regard to why you wrote it and what you hope to achieve with it?
Sure. So I grew up in a upper middle class family in neighborhood in Vancouver. Went to private school. My father was a psychiatrist. I suppose that sometimes is half the problem. I grew up like any other kid, and we can get into more details later. But if I think back to who I was, and your listeners can or viewers can think about who they were at the age of 3 or 4. What was the core essence of their being? I was this bright, curious, mischievous, stubborn, defiant little guy who was open to the world. And then life happens to us, and it's not always safe to stay open. And long story short, I ended up in the punk scene, and then from the punk scene to the skinhead scene. And once the skinhead scene turned overtly white power and neo-Nazi and stuff like that, I was sort of all in that area. It became my identity. It was who I was. Wasn't just what I believed. It was who I was. It was my it was what I listened to. It was what I read. It was what I watched. It was the friends I kept. It was the clothes I wore. It was not just an ideology, but ideology and identity become intertwined. And spent a number of years, starting off as a skinhead, and later, with the whole concept of mainstreaming that was sort of introduced in the 90s. Moved to a suit and tie. I ran a computerized telephone hotline that ran afoul of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal twice and went to the Supreme Court of Canada. I was involved in building the Aryan Resistance Movement, which was Canada's largest neo-Nazi skinhead organization, before getting involved with Aryan Nations and then White Aryan Resistance and Tom Metzger. So I was sort of all in quite a high profile and leadership position. And then something happened, and that was the birth of my daughter. And I didn't have a road to Damascus moment, but it started a process. It started a thawing process, because I was completely cut off from my heart and from my humanity. And I truly believe this. The level at which we dehumanize other human beings is a mere reflection of our own internal disconnection and dehumanization. And my children started the process, and a son born 15 months later, and I got to parent him the way that I always wanted to be parented, which was very cathartic, and sort of started this process of coming out the other side. And I found myself as a single father with 2 children, and I think that provided the platform for me to let go of the identity that was neo-Nazi Tony and all of that. And I was able to get all the same things, the attention, acceptance, approval, and a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning by being a single dad. And I got those things in a healthy way. So I was able to transition out. But even though I'd left the movement hadn't quite left me. And a lot of my belief systems were still intact. They didn't occupy the primary position. They dropped down a second, third, fourth, and so on. And it was meeting a coach and a mentor later on and counselor that actually took me back to dismantle the armor and the masks that I was wearing to hide and protect who little Tony was. And that began a journey of over 1,000 hours of one-on-one and group counseling, through which, in the book, I unpack a lot of things that happened both before and after through that lens of all the counseling, so you can help to understand. I don't ever blame anything that I did on my childhood. Everything I did, I chose to do, but to help people understand the lens through which I made those choices, and thereby understanding the lens through which other young men and women might be making similar choices. And the book doesn't end with my leaving that movement behind. That's about the halfway point. The back end of the book is, leaving it's the first step. It's not the final step. It's not the end point. It's the beginning point for a new piece. So I explore themes of and my own journey, and going back to communities that I had once harmed, and exploring compassion, forgiveness, atonement, making amends. And to the point where I talk about co-founding Life After Hate and the work that we do, and sort of how we do it. I've since left Life After Hate to focus on projects with the book. But That in a nutshell is my journey, and the book sort of helps you understand how this upper middle class kid chose the lifestyle that I chose, and how I was able to get out of it, how I was able to heal from it. Because leaving, like I said, is just the first part, and then how I was able to make amends. And so I've got advice for parents who might be worried about their kids. It's got advice for communities on how to respond to the violent far right. And I think anybody who's struggling with being in the violent far right should be able to see some of themselves in the book. And it's massive change is possible. You just have to have the courage.
I think personally that the most fascinating part of the book is that you can totally see the processing and the work that you've done. That is, you've realized that your commitment to an extremist movement and an extremist ideology and identity was had so much more to do with the internal processes going on and even what preceded it, and to be able to link to them. For example, you talk about the tug of war between identities. You talk about putting on masks. You talk about self-medicating, almost treating the extremist ideology as an addiction as well, not just with regard to the alcoholism, but also looking at the correlations between what extremism does for you. And I think that that's the real true value of the book. You can tell that this is not from someone who just left the movement and then moved on with their life. This is someone who left the movement and wanted to be retrospective about why they entered it into the first place, and connected healing deeply from those experiences and what preceded those experiences, so that one could become a better person. And we have a lot of people that we work with at Parallel Networks that are at the early levels of their disengagement. I have to say, number one, that the book is a must read for anyone who's ever been in an extremist movement, because what it gives you is it lets you know the depth of how much growth is not only required, but what growth and work that is done on yourself can lead to with regard to true transformation. Tony is actually probably the most balanced former that I think I know in the former sphere, so to say, if we call it that. And Tony himself has gotten to a point where he kind of rejects the notion of a former, because he doesn't want former extremists to define his identity, if I'm correct, Tony. But
Yeah, pretty
can
much.
you tell us, I mean, basically and simplistically, and then sort of go on a little bit, the realizations that you have in the book were not there when you first left the movement, right? And how
No.
did you get to that point? And what are some advice that we can take for those that are interested in leaving movements, or those that just recently left movements, about how they can really do that deep inner work that you described? So it's really an amazing psychological journey that you take us on in the book, the process of your mental psychological change and how that led you to become open to spiritual transformation.
Yeah, and spiritual transformation is definitely a part of it. I'm not religious. There's no denomination I belong to, and the Catholic school I went to long since beat the Catholicism out of me. But I'm very spiritual and very connected, and understand and experience the connection between everything and everyone. And I go for these walking meditations in the forest near my house, and it's I refer to the forest as my church, or refer to the forest as my spiritual chiropractor. So anytime I feel out of whack, off center, I can go there and get readjusted. So there definitely is a spiritual connection, and really the whole underlying theme is connection, and how we are connected, and how we are connected from ourselves, and how we become disconnected from ourselves. And that is the key to how we connect or disconnect to the world outside of us. And I believe that the level or the quality of the relationships that we have with other human beings is defined by the quality of the relationship we have with ourselves. And that's another part of the book, is to, when we can understand how we got to how we made the choices that we made, that we can begin to forgive ourselves and sort of put an end to the self-loathing, the self-hatred, the self-alienation that I think is at the core of not just people joining violent extremist groups, but it's the core of addiction, eating disorders, a whole host of things. I think toxic shame is what I talk about a fair bit, and that's the alienation of the self that happens through our experiences, that happens through when we think about things that have happened to us, we have some very subjective meanings around people, places, and things, and if those are very negative, they can sort of pollute our lives and distort the choices that we make. And if we go back and can reframe what's happened to us, where we can go back and change the subjective meanings of people, places, and things involved with our pain, then we actually can change the future, the way we experience lives yet our lives unlived. So that's it's a very powerful tool in that way.
Very beautiful. It's very beautiful. You talk a lot about toxic shame, and I saw one statement with regard to it was kind of indirect. It might have been related to your book or not. I think it was. And it came from another former, and they suggested that this idea that we have to get over our shame as formers is inappropriate, that we have to acknowledge our shame and that we have to embody that shame and that we have to show humility and we should walk around with shame because, in a sense, it's healthy to do that because then it means that you are completely repentant and you should always be sort of, feel guilty or ashamed for who you were. I'm not so sure I agree with that, but I wanted to pick your brain about that because the concept of toxic shame seems to me to be at the core of most of the people that we work with and my own experiences as well. What role does shame play in radicalization? And then what role does addressing shame play in getting out of the situation and transforming into a space where you don't have to live with that anxiety and that shame overburdening?
Right, and shame is often greatly misunderstood. And there's healthy shame and toxic shame. And
Yep.
if we go look at any emotion, healthy emotions, they're transitory.
Mm-hmm.
They arise and then they pass away. Anger can be a very healthy emotion, but when it's there 24/7, it's no longer anger, it's rage, and that's something very different. And there's healthy shame or healthy guilt is I did bad, I did wrong. Toxic shame is I am bad, I am wrong. And if we're not careful about how we frame that for people, that healthy shame is a good thing, and we absolutely should have it. But we shouldn't forever beat ourselves up or feel that we're evil, we're flawed. Once we do that, the toxic shame is like an impaired sense of self. And when people talk about, well, they hate these other groups of people because they hate themselves. When we look in the mirror and we see, and our mind says, you're unlovable, you're not pretty enough, you're not smart enough, you're not worthy, you're invisible, weak, powerless. When we have these thoughts about ourselves, that's what toxic shame is. And human beings spend an inordinate amount of time doing two things. One is hiding that shame from the rest of the world, and hiding it from ourselves. Shame is the dirty little secret we keep from ourselves. And again, I'm talking about toxic shame here. So if the toxic shame is the feeling of being less than, that's there 24/7, and it sits in the basement of our subconscious identity belief system. What's one of the ways that we live in reaction to it? Because as human beings, we live in reaction to hide our shame. Well, what's a word that's the opposite of shame? Pride, right? Proud boys. I'm proud of my race. And the feeling of less than, I adopted an ideology that told me I was greater than. It felt really good for me to be part of the master race, and all of that stuff. And so we live our lives in reaction to it. The way that we hide it from ourselves is substance abuse. When a young woman looks in the mirror and sees, fat and ugly, and has to, you know, purge herself, so and you get into eating disorders. That's all toxic shame, reaction based behavior, and it comes out in two ways. We either project it onto other people, through violence, through racism, through emotional violence, and that all the way down the line to murder. Murder, I think, is the ultimate externalized expression of toxic shame. And Dr. Gilligan, who wrote Violent Study of a National Epidemic, was a forensic psychologist that worked, I think it was San Quentin, for 25 years. And he basically said, I never saw an act of violence that wasn't rooted in humiliation or shame. At the same side, John Bradshaw, who wrote Healing the Shame That Binds You, which is the best book I've ever read to understand how toxic shame manifests itself, and there's a whole variety of ways in which it does it, and how it's passed down from generation to generation within families. Um, and he was an addictions guy, and he said, toxic shame is the root of all addiction. And so we internalize that toxic shame, and through eating disorders, cutting, risky sexual behavior, playing a sport where you break a bone every 2 weeks or whatever. And suicide is the ultimate internalized shame activity. So I see, from suicide to murder, this, you know, this arc. Half of it's internalized and half of it's externalized, that has toxic shame at the root.
It's really
And so
it's really a beautiful.
we can leave the
way to see
movement.
these things. Yeah. Go ahead.
We
Continue.
can leave the movement behind, but if we don't deal with that toxic shame, it's just going to spill out in another way. And that's why, a lot of the guys that I knew from back then, especially on the skinhead side of things, a number of them that are dead from drug overdoses. Like, the movement sort of fell apart, and then I hear the two themes I hear is, they became an enforcer for a biker gang, or they died of a drug overdose, or they were a drug addict. And so it's better than staying, but we have to deal with the underlying traumas, or the pain is going to continue, and it's going to have to be masked and sort of hidden.
It's like in substance abuse recovery, when they say the simple slogan, if nothing changes, nothing changes. Just because you've left jihadism, far right wing extremism, or another form of extremism, doesn't mean that anything internal is going to get any better. You still have all the wounds, still have all the anxiety, and still have all that shame.
I was still an asshole.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'd get drunk and I'd be mean to people with my sarcastic wit, and humiliating them in front of people. I was still a jerk. I may not have been a racist jerk, but I was still had this mean streak, towards people that didn't clear up until I met someone to help me go back and heal that feeling of being unlovable, being invisible, being powerless and weak and not worthy.
Yeah. I want to shift. I want to shift and talk, expand that out, because I really like the way that you also talk about collective toxic shame, right? And you give this
Yeah.
example in your book of how insidious toxic collective shame is, where you say that you weren't aware during your time in the movement as a white supremacist any of the effects, and that now you can basically see them, and you can even see them academically and analytically. And you talk about how believing that African Americans had a lower IQ, right, than white people, on the aggregate. But that then looking at studies of how if you simply ask people to identify as African American or white or whatnot before they take tests, they actually do worse when they're asked to identify, because there's an anxiety, obviously, that is associated with that, and the stigma begins to affect you almost in the same way that you can become a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy if people continue to tell you that you're bad or you're evil. Um, there is two ways that we might think that that works, and I really am interested to see. Um, a lot of times extremists aim to split the world into an us versus them mentality. And anytime they can confirm that us versus them, then it suits their own ambitions and it further cements their rationale or their belief that they're in the right space. But there's also maybe an unrecognized method that works to fire up extremism, in the sense that the people that they are antagonizing can also, in a sense, incorporate some level of collective toxicity with regard to the way they see the movement, not being able to understand that these are human beings at the core. They may be fractured human beings, they may be hindered and harmed human beings, but that there are reasons that gets there. And so that transitions into concepts such as empathy and radical compassion. And I think on the individual level, the book makes it very clear, and it takes us on a long voyage of the individual stuff. And of course, you can only fit but so much in the book. And you come out and you talk about ways that we can apply your model, so to say, for collectives as well. But I wonder, do you think that the way that we treat the problem of extremism can also be a manifestation of the inward status of those that look at extremism, for example? The interplay between the internal dynamics and the state of our collective society at large, and what is it that we get from demonizing extremists, and what does that do? Is that counterproductive? Is that helpful? Is that what is the best way? How can we deal with collective shame at the national, international, and global level? Or do we need to think about such things? Does the concept of collective toxic shame help us better understand the state of the world that we're living in and how we might resolve those issues that are continuously driving us further apart?
Yeah, it's it's funny because, well, I mean, it's not funny, but it's curious. You can have people that that have their own toxic shame, but it's in a they dehumanize people that are okay to dehumanize. We're talking about, in my experience, it was Jews and people of color. But if we dehumanize Nazis, that to me that's not any different. If we dehumanize people because they're homeless or they're drug addicted or they wear red political caps, I think when we dehumanize anybody for any reason, that's problematic, and that's something we have to work on. And that collective shame or that group shame, where entire groups of people are made to feel guilty or feel less than because of who they are, not what they've done, and whether it be from Islamophobia or the effects of misguided foreign policy. It's important to address that, and I think that people can miss the boat, especially in academia, when they look at things from that. I mean, granted they have to be dispassionate, but dehumanizing lens at the same time that can also happen, where they see it strictly through an academic framework without any connection to humanity and in their work. I get that there has to be that certain amount of distance and such, but I've met academics that clearly have their own personal issues around dehumanization and connection to their own humanity, because it's part of the human condition. I mean, it's going to be out there. But when we talk about some of these other groups, and especially when it comes to IQ, because it's a thing you hear on the far right all the time about race and IQ, and we look at it. I looked at it from a point of, well, it's genetic, right? But what we understand about genetics and epigenetics, the whole nature versus nurture thing, is we've come to the place where it's actually both. And it wasn't until I saw, in the north of England, and these tenement housing things where there was welfare moms with 5 kids and years generational families of welfare and drug addiction and all of that stuff, and they were all white. They living the same stereotype that I used to hold towards African Americans. But these were all white. It was more environmental, it had nothing to do with genetics, and that's how we had applied those really base theories towards other people. And I think it's important to recognize that, because I think that's one of the big arguing points on the other side, is that it's all genetically predisposed, and it's not. It can happen because of environmental reasons, because of the collective experience reasons, because of all of those shame reasons. And sure, individual genetics may play a part, but that collective experience sure makes a huge difference.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the one thing that you can shape, if you want to do good for another, so to say, is the environment and the context in which they exist. It's a hell of a lot easier to change space, to change schooling, to change context, and to create opportunities, to create safe spaces for individuals. And I think that we don't recognize that a lot of times the things that we've experienced, we might take for granted. I mean, a lot of this stuff has to do with class differentiation and an inability to understand working class populations. And so I guess because we want to keep this relatively short, because people have very short attention spans today, how do we apply your model not just to extremism? Um, how do we use it to heal as humanity, and why would we need to? I mean, so there's two sides to look at our current state of affairs. One is the pessimistic side, that things are continuously getting worse, then we're on the brink of either climatic catastrophe, potentially geopolitical catastrophe, or even in some ways a collapse from within with regard to the fragmentation and implosion of democracy. And then the other way to look at it is to say, wait a minute, that's a little irrational. If you look at history from the long view, things have never been better. We've pulled billions of people out of poverty. Things are running relatively smoothly. Wars don't kill as many people as they used to. There's not actually as much blood on our hands. But then when you look at the levels of violent extremism, you really say, what? When your expertise is this, you start to see it everywhere, and there's enough terrorist attacks and enough extremist attacks to keep you sort of not just awake at night, to make you wonder what kind of contextual circumstance and what kind of culture can lead people to go into high schools when they're that young and kill their classmates? What kind of suicide rates that are rising, and depression and alienation and feelings of isolation and anger with the government and socioeconomic status and inequality and all of these things? Where do you fall on that continuum? And how can we utilize some of what you talk about in Cure for Hate uh, to tap into that if we want to play a role in trying to make sure that we contribute to making the world a better place and healing ourselves in the process?
Well, I spent 15 years of my life in that white supremacist movement, trying to change the world in a in a subconscious effort to change things for me and how I felt about myself and how I felt about myself in the world, to no avail, to great frustration and no avail. And what I've learned, and this I learned this through the journey in the book, is I've learned that I have far more ability to change the world by changing who I am in the world. And that sort of gets back to Gandhi's "be the change you wish to seek." And as human beings, we have an incredible power to inspire and influence people around us if we open our eyes, become aware of that fact, and start to put it into motion. And I laugh and joke about, in Vancouver, McDonald's had kale salad for a while. If you'd have told me 10 years ago that McDonald's was going to have a kale salad, I just said, no way, you're sniffing glue. But how does kale salad get to be on the McDonald's menu? It's not the government that comes in and legislates kale salad. It's not some law or anything like that. It's what everyday people are choosing to put in their mouths to eat in every bite of every meal that they take, and it's millions of little actions that create the market conditions that change what McDonald's puts on the menu when it comes to kale, right? And I think if we bring that back to who we are in the world, and it's who we decide to be in every moment of every day, in inspiring the people around us to be better, to have more compassion, to treat, and compassion doesn't mean weakness. It doesn't mean being a pushover. Compassion, when it's combined with healthy boundaries and consequences, is a very, I think, tough love. I was thinking just the other day of a great example of compassion with healthy boundaries and consequences, and that's the Shaolin Kung Fu monks in China who were meditative, compassion, but their monasteries kept getting robbed by bandits. So they've created this martial art, ferocious martial art, to be able to deal with the bandits, but so that they can continue their practice of meditation, compassion, and that inward journey. That's for me a great example of compassion with healthy boundaries and consequences. But I think it's we embark on a journey, and I've embarked on a journey of radical compassion. Radical compassion has two components to it. Number one, your practice of compassion has to take you outside your comfort zone. Sure, things are in places pretty rough out there, and it looks pretty bleak. But we're not going to solve any of the problems of the world from within our comfort zone. So we have to be prepared to step out of our comfort zone. Number two, empathy is feeling what another person's feeling. Compassion is taking action to alleviate that suffering. So empathy plus action equals compassion. Radical compassion adds a social activist component. And that means taking action to change the environment which gives rise to or supports that suffering. And the third one, which is the most courageous thing I think a human being can do, is to do that journey within. In order to give compassion, to truly give compassion to other people, we have to mine it from within ourselves. And I think that journey inward, I think, is one of the most magnificent journeys. And when we do that journey inward, we change, we change the subjective meaning to the people, places, and things from our past and transform them. And I've watched relationships, without me doing or saying anything with the other person, relationships shift and change as we change what's going on within us. And the more I did that journey, the more my life transformed to the better. And I think if people want to change the world, they should start going on that journey and inspire others to do the same, and to be the best version of you that you can be. And it's a magnificent journey, but it's within the power of every individual. I think it's the responsibility of every individual to have a close look and change who they are in every moment of every day, so that they can inspire change in all the people around them. And it's not like we're atomized and we don't influence each other. We can atomize and form a powerful collective by inspiring people to this better, higher state of being with themselves and with the world.
Beautiful. Words of wisdom, and the book is a great journey. I strongly recommend it for even social workers, educators, people that are dealing with trauma. It's a really good paradigm, a particularly important contextual conversation about white supremacy, extremism in general, and how it has much more to do with the meaning, the significance, the glory, and the identity that you get than it does just this ideology and this way of seeing the world. It is a tool that is useful for all of us, but particularly those that pay attention to the work here at Light Upon Light, that are thinking about exiting or have exited. I myself have been out of jihadism for 7, 8 years now completely, and benefited tremendously from the insight. I love the paradigm leading up to radical compassion. I think it's a great way to look at things, and contrary to popular belief, experiences in extremism are at least subjectively spiritual. And if there is no spiritual component to life after hate, and if there is no spiritual collective that you can sell to people that would otherwise choose hate, then I think we're very limited in our understanding. And to some degree, I think that's what's wrong with what we pitch in the world today with regard to simplistic notions of materialism and consumerism driving the purposes for our existence. Much more to discuss. This was the very first book club conversation that we're going to have. Due to technical issues, we had to delay. We missed the time today, so we don't have the opportunity for internet interactivity. But this book is timeless. It's right here. It's called The Cure for Hate. I don't know if you can see that, but it's timeless. And so what we'll do is we'll run this back again as we continue to evolve and grow, and we'll be having and hearing a lot more from Tony going forward. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a must read for anyone that watches this video going far into the future. It's well worth your time. It's a really, really deep introspective dive. I thank you for putting your soul out onto paper for us, Tony. And if there's any closing words that you'd like to have, feel free. The floor is yours.
Just thank you for choosing my book to be the first one in the series, and I just have a lot of gratitude and thank you for being a good friend.
Yeah, thank you too. You're a beautiful person, and I implore you to continue doing the work that you do. I learn a lot